Hey, it's Alex Williams, the New Stack, and we are here at KubeCon in Barcelona. The conference is coming to an end, and one of the things that we've been able to really get into is these different Kubernetes deployments. There's more and more of these distributions. And the question really is, how do you make sense of these? How do you actually kind of move through these infrastructures so you can actually deploy them correctly and deciding which one to deploy correctly? And so joining me today is Joe Duffy, and Joe is CEO and founder of Pulumi. And Joe really talks a lot about this notion of invisibility. And Pulumi talks about this notion of invisibility and using code really to really solve these very complex problems. Joe, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here.
So you have a blog post up called Pulumi, A Better Way to Kubernetes. And I think this kind of sums up your approach, doesn't it? Maybe you could give us a quick assessment of that complexity in these different Kubernetes managed environments. We have one from Amazon. We have a few from Google, right? We have smaller providers offering these capabilities to use Kubernetes as a managed service. How does Pulumi fit in there? What is that interface that customers are needing right now?
Yeah, it's a great question, especially at this conference. You know, we've talked to a lot of people using Kubernetes in a lot of different environments, all the way from bare metal on-premise to VMs on-premise to various cloud providers. And, you know, Pulumi is a infrastructure as code solution that sort of embraces Kubernetes in a first-class way. And because of that, we can provision resources on any of the clouds in addition to provisioning cloud-native, you know, Kubernetes resources. So we sit at a sort of an interesting vantage point where we are actually helping customers go into all these different clouds and manage clouds and use EKS or AKS or GKE, Anthos on-prem. The good news is at a certain line in sort of the architecture, it's all just Kubernetes, right? So once you've built the foundational infrastructure, you're actually just using the Kubernetes object model, which is consistent across all of these distros, modulo some minor differences. The key challenge that we find working with customers is really understanding how do I go from not having a Kubernetes cluster to actually having a fully functioning Kubernetes environment that's secure, you know, debuggable, reliable, that my team can use. And that's the hard part, because that is very different in each of the cloud providers. If you're in Amazon, you want to use IAM, you know, the same way that you do for all of your other services. Mm-hmm. And configuring IAM is really difficult, and it's unfortunate because that's security, right? And configuring, you know, the networking to make sure your API server in Kubernetes isn't accidentally open to the internet. That's not the default experience that most customers have. So the default experience is not secure, not diagnosable, not debuggable. And that differs between different cloud providers, and most people don't know that on day one. They found out afterwards.
Mm-hmm. So when you're looking at these different providers, how are you understanding the differences? How are you starting to understand these different, you know, the nuances? Are you pretty involved in the upstream communities?
Yeah, part of it's being involved in upstream. You know, our head of product is actually, you know, leads one of the SIG groups around AWS integration. So we're involved at that level. I think, honestly, the best thing for us, though, is working with customers and helping them solve their problems. You know, over the past year, we've spent a lot of time with some major customers in all of these different environments, you know, learning through trial by fire, you know, getting it wrong, helping them solve problems. And over time, we've built up these playbooks of what it takes to go from not having a cluster to having a fully functioning EKS cluster in Amazon, fully configured. And of course, the other cloud providers as well.
Tell me more of those playbooks then. What is your approach to these playbooks?
So it really is, again, you know, the foundation is security. So we always try to get the security right from the outset. The next is networking, and really making sure that, hey, you've got a virtual, you know, a VPC set up with proper subnetting so that you're not accidentally leaking, you know, endpoints to the internet. And then on top of that, you've got the cluster, so EKS cluster, and then, you know, all the cluster services. Maybe you want to use Prometheus, but most AWS customers are going to use CloudWatch because that's the first class, you know, thing that most of these AWS customers are trained on. Their ops team already knows how to use CloudWatch. They do alerting and eventing based on it. They don't necessarily want to manage this Prometheus software. And once you've got that set up, now you can deploy applications. And so we work with folks to do continuous deployment of their applications, whether it's with GitLab, CodeFresh, any of these other, CI/CD platforms.
So let's talk about that base level security, because one of the things that's interesting at this show is, the security postures that we're starting to see emerge and the security practices that we're starting to see emerge in cloud native environments. The attack surface is much larger. And GitLab was talking about this in terms of like how they view zero trust. How do you view zero trust? How do you view zero trust in this cloud native landscape? Because you have plugins that can be exploited through remote executions. You can have a lateral movement that can happen very, very easily. How do you set that foundation? What is those principles that you go by?
I think honestly, for computer science, there's been one principle that has always stood the test of time, which is the principle of least authority, which is you do not grant access to perform an activity unless it's explicitly requested or explicitly required. So the default is nothing should be exposed to the internet. No authenticated user should be able to do anything in a cluster. And then you work through and say, okay, I'm going to onboard my team. I'm going to give them the least possible privilege, that makes them able to do their jobs. And then I'm going to go and lock down my CD environments too. It turns out CD environments tend to be some of the most privileged. Not many people kind of realize this because the CD environment is the one that's typically going into production and manipulating resources and configuring things. Usually you're not going to give anybody on your team other than super users, the ability to do that. And so the idea is if you lock everything down as much as possible, then if accidentally, a couple of my teammates actually got, their phone stolen at this conference. Here, unfortunately, they're just walking around and suddenly their phone was missing.
Where, like in the city?
Yeah, in the city. But if you've got your AWS creds on there, now suddenly, potentially some random person has AWS creds that can access your cluster, right? These things happen. You lose your laptop. Any of these things can happen. So using 2FA and other techniques can help mitigate this. But if ultimately those keys don't have, privileged access, then you're actually reducing risk there as well. And so actually going through and being rigorous about this, it's difficult to do because it's much easier, it's much more productive to just say, give access to everyone, right? But that's almost always the wrong thing to do.
Yeah, right. And we heard this kind of, like kind of these, like the principles of, the zero trust approach is like, defining your priorities, right? If you're a site like GitLab, you want to be focusing on GitLab.com, right? If you're a company like GitLab as well, you have lots of endpoints out there that you need to be protecting all the time because people might be in airports, they might be walking down the street and getting their phone stolen, right? And then there's the last one is the infrastructure itself. Mm-hmm. That to me is when it gets into the networking story much more, right? So networking security then is kind of this next generation, isn't it? I mean, how do you view that? Because you were talking about the leaks kind of in the networking environment.
Yeah, it's honestly, a good friend of mine has been a developer on the Istio project at Google since day one, and I was talking to him just recently, like, hey, what are you seeing in the wild? What are people actually using Istio for? Is it service mesh? And he actually said the number one thing they're seeing is actually network security, because they have a way of intercepting network packets and running it through a rules system that they've built to be able to identify foreign traffic that shouldn't be on the network or to just log packets or what have you. And I see a lot of work that Tigera is doing around compliance with network policy. I do think there's some great tools in this space and that are probably not as well known as they should be, and techniques as well. I think people look at Istio and they think service mesh. They don't necessarily think, I can use that for networking security. And I think over the next year or two, we will get a lot more experience with that, and hopefully what you'll see is communities emerge that are sharing best practices and sharing what policies they've used in their organizations. But we're very early days still on that.
Right. So when you're looking at the Kubernetes distributions out there, the managed services, what are like the distinctions you're seeing between an AWS and a Google, and in Azure, for example?
Yeah, so I should say, we're partners of all the clouds, and so we love the partnership and everything. But it is very interesting to just see the differences, especially even we sponsor all the major cloud events too. So we go and we see which features they're investing in and kind of the message that's being told to customers. I would say, GKE, just because, Kubernetes came out of Google and GKE was the first, GKE is really solid. In terms of, a guy on my team, Mike, who used to be at CoreOS, likes to tell the story of he spun up a GKE cluster sort of on day one when they launched it, and ever since he's been pushing the upgrade button, and it's never failed, and it's always upgraded to the latest version. I think, Amazon is definitely hearing from the customers that they want to use Kubernetes, and so they're investing, and they will get there. I know Amazon always delivers something at the end of the day that's solid, but at this point, the reality is we see a lot of customers using Fargate in AWS, the ECS service, the more native AWS container service, and that is a great experience. And so it's interesting talking to customers on Amazon. Oftentimes we want to say, hey, actually, you probably don't need Kubernetes if you're just on Amazon. If you're an AWS shop, you should just use Fargate.
Right.
It's great. It works. It's performant. It's easy. You don't need to manage an entire Kubernetes cluster. But if you're really going to operationalize Kubernetes, if you made that bet for Kubernetes, there is a vast difference in maturity in the three cloud providers.
So the maturity is different. So EKS is catching up. That means they're going to be more involved in the upstream community, as I expect.
Mm-hmm.
GKE is security is fundamental for GKE. Azure, how do you distinguish Azure? And how they view it.
Azure is interesting because I was talking to somebody recently at Microsoft, in fact, about the difference in the communities when we go to these conferences. We're at Microsoft Build, we sponsored Build. A lot of developers that are targeting Azure really want to use paths, right? You find that whether it's higher level function apps or websites and so what we find with a lot of our customers is that's what they want. They actually, Kubernetes is sort of an implementation detail, right? AKS gets the job done, and the container instances actually sort of like Google Cloud Run, like what they launched a year ago, right? So it has a lot of those capabilities. So it's sort of the serverless containers, if you will. So I think Azure is doing some really great work, more at the higher level sort of PaaS-like abstractions, which frankly people are going to want to get to, right? I think most developers don't want to have to think about even at the level of Kubernetes. What we're finding is it's a very low-level set of abstractions for developers to think about. Forget the cluster. This is just the application model.
So what are some of the things you've been hearing here at the show? What are some of the conversations what are some of the conversations you've had with customers here? What are people talking about when they come by and when you have their conversation with them?
I think there are a few things, and obviously it's a little self-selected bias because they come by the Pulumi booth and they're talking to us Pulumi people. But I think right now there's a bifurcation between infrastructure management tools and Kubernetes management tools, and people are struggling with that because of everything I mentioned, right? If you're going to set up a Kubernetes cluster, you need to think about IAM, you need to think about CloudWatch, you need to think about maybe I don't want to host a database myself, maybe I actually want to use RDS because or Cosmos DB if I'm in Azure, or Cloud Spanner in Google. These hosted data services are really rich and easier to use than me managing my own data. So we find people struggling to navigate sort of the classic, cloud infrastructure and hosted services and Kubernetes. And Pulumi is actually kind of uniquely positioned to handle all of it because we do infrastructure as code across both. We hear people struggling with the walls of YAML, and various templating solutions for YAML, various ways of merging this YAML with that YAML, and we hear at scale that just is breaking down and not working.
Right, because one of the thing you said in this post, one of the things that it was by Levi Blackstone, that must be someone on your staff, but nobody likes programming in YAML, and templates make it even harder. It's difficult to understand the state of the cluster. Did my deployment succeed? Why is my app working on and on and on?
Yeah. Today, the way kube control works is you take some YAML files and you kind of just feed them into the tool, and then it posts them to the API server and returns success. But it turns out your deployment may be failing, and so now you're left, tailing logs and trying to figure out, hey, why is my application not actually coming up? And so we've sort of built that into the way that we do deployments for Kubernetes. And of course, being infrastructure as code using real languages, most of our customers are using Python or TypeScript to express these instead of YAML. And especially if you look at Helm charts are just growing crazy out of control. As Helm charts become more robust and production ready, that means necessarily they have a lot more logic in them. And the way that Helm is currently doing that, and of course it's going to be different for Helm 3.
Isn't Helm just a YAML chart? Isn't it what it is?
It is, but because of the need to conditionalize, they've enabled you to do Go templates, which is the Go programming language has a templating solution.
Yeah.
So you can bake those into your YAML. But your templates then have to worry about white space, and it's not working in practice.
Well, I mean, templates from a very kind of rudimentary point of view are always trouble, no matter how you think about them, right?
Right.
Trying to move from like a PDF to HTML, for example.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and they don't have abstraction, right? That's the thing most of our customers find with Pulumi is, hey, I can actually refactor this out into a function. I can define a class that hides some of this complexity, and you just don't have that with YAML.
So one of the things that you talk about is, infrastructure as code, but you also talk about clusters as code, right? And are you defining infrastructure as clusters, essentially then? And and how do you distinguish then that terminology?
Yeah, so I think of clusters as one piece of the infrastructure. Going back to my layering, of the IAM networking cluster services, and the application, each one of those can be defined in code. And the clusters as code component of that is, today to provision an EKS cluster in Amazon, you kind of have to go read this page, which is, 50 pages long. I don't know if it's 10 pages long, which is a lot of manual commands. You go provision stuff in Amazon, you provision stuff in Kubernetes. We have an EKS cluster package that we've defined, and we share it using package managers. And so the cluster itself is just a piece of code that we've written to define, how a cluster gets configured.
Okay. And so that allows you then to look across the different layers, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, we have been working with some pretty big customers on how to do continuous delivery across all those layers. And that's something in a complex environment. This customer we're working with, they have 12 production environments because they're geo-distributed across the globe. So when they do a deployment, that's a complicated thing. And not only are they deploying applications, they're actually deploying infrastructure updates using Kubernetes. And so, having this ability to think about the layers and think about how they interact is very powerful.
So looking out beyond KubeCon, over the next 6 months, what are some of the market trends you're starting to see that you kind of when you're reading the tea leaves over being at these events over the past few months, and you must be starting to see some patterns emerge, overall kind of in questions that customers are having, problems that they're having, but also kind of looking at kind of the new capabilities that are always being introduced, into the cloud native community. What are some of those learnings that you've taken away that are then pointing you to kind of the better, thinking then through the rest of the year?
I think, I've always said that Kubernetes is a means to an end, not an end unto itself. It's a way to run containers, right? Most developers just want to run their application, and Kubernetes happens to be a standardized way of running containerized applications. And I think over the coming year, you see Kubernetes fade a little bit into the distance in the sense that it is becoming the standard. All the cloud providers have embraced it. So now it's not controversial anymore. It's not a question of, is Mesosphere or Docker Swarm or Kubernetes? It's clear. Kubernetes is one.
Marathon is, for example, there used to be a number of orchestrators.
Right. And even Marathon, we actually talked to customers who are running Kubernetes in Mesosphere, because Mesos can bootstrap the VMs, and then they deploy Kubernetes on top. So I think the next year you'll see a lot more of these no-code solutions. I think you'll see a lot more container-based solutions that run without even thinking that there's a cluster there. I think people will just start taking the cluster for granted. And I think that's a good thing. And I see a lot of the pieces coming together that are required to do so. Now, there's certainly a lot of people in the world who not take the clusters for granted, right? The people operating the clusters themselves that have to secure them. So you'll see more depth there, right? We've seen a lot of breadth. I think for people operating the clusters, you'll see a lot of depth in areas like how do you secure the network? How do you secure the perimeter?
So the depth becomes the depth comes in how do you manage the security, for example?
I think security is the number one depth area that still needs a lot of work because it's just so early.
What needs work?
A lot of education, frankly. I think a lot of people don't even know, like if I'm running Kubernetes in Amazon, do I know that I should be thinking about mapping, RBAC in Kubernetes to IAM in AWS? And if so, like how do I do that? So I think a lot of these companies out there, like VMware, are doing a great job educating, the community. And so you see a lot of education, but I do think folks like Calico and Tigera will start, evolving this in this space. I think also, technologies like Istio hopefully get simpler to use so that people can actually use them for these use cases.
Mm-hmm. And so how does that affect kind of your own roadmap and how you're thinking about, what your services that you can offer back to your customers and the community?
Yeah, it's very consistent. We're just trying to make it as easy as possible to do the right thing. One of my colleagues at Microsoft used to have this phrase, fall into the pit of success. It's like you just accidentally fell into the pit of success. Isn't that wonderful? Like you didn't even have to think about it. It just worked, right? So that's sort of what we're trying to enable with not just Kubernetes. I mean, to be honest, a significant percentage of our customers are using Kubernetes, but there's plenty of people that are not. I mentioned Fargate. There's a ton of happy customers using Fargate. But for us, it's how do we have out-of-the-box support for easy-to-use cloud-native software that uses the best practices without you even having to think about it. That's a challenging thing, especially because we're covering AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, Kubernetes. We just launched, DigitalOcean support. So we're really supporting a lot of different cloud providers, and we have to go deep in each one of those so that customers don't have to.
So that's kind of a focus and emphasis then?
Yes.
Right. And so then coming into these next 6 months, is that kind of where you're going to be seeing direction in terms of what we should be expecting from Pulumi, is like looking more in depth into those different areas?
Yeah, we have some exciting stuff coming up soon for AWS specifically that really helps make it much easier to use. But we're going to keep supporting multiple clouds and just raising the level of abstraction. I think that helps to tell the Pulumi story succinctly. We talked to lots of customers using other infrastructure as code solutions, and when they come to Pulumi, they say, "Wow, I get the entire programming language at my fingertips. I can use abstraction. I can use my favorite editors. I can use my favorite tools." But when you see this, 25,000 lines of YAML drop to 500 lines of beautiful code that you understand and is familiar and easy to work with, that's when the light bulb really goes off. And we see customers just make a in the moment decision that, hey, this is the future. This is what we're going to bet on. Great.
Well, Joe, thank you so much for taking the time to talk, and it's been good to catch up with you here at KubeCon plus CloudNativeCon in Barcelona. We will be waiting for your news on AWS and what that's going to bring, and plus the continued analysis I think that you provide about the overall Kubernetes community. So thanks for taking the time to talk today.
Yeah, thanks, Al. It's always fun.